gig if you can get it, but it's certainly robbing the American middle class blind.
One thing you emphasize is that you say nations can create, nations don't have to borrow, and that is kind of the core philosophy of your monetary reform.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Why would a nation borrow money? Why would we have a national debt? Why would we borrow money? The average person on the street, and even the average politician in Congress, you hear it every single night on TV. They'll say, oh, the government is printing too much money. The government prints zero money. The banks create every single dollar in existence with the exception of coin money. Yes, the government does coin money. That's money without debt, the only form of money without debt that we currently have in the United States. Every single other dollar is created as an interest-bearing debt by commercial banks, and that's got to stop.
And in your film, you do also go into the history of how the Federal Reserve was set up. So you were talking to G. Edward Griffin. I have read his book a while back. What are the areas that you differ strongly in his ideas of monetary reform? Because you both of you guys have written about how, or you did your film about how the Federal Reserve, how it was set up.
Yeah, Ed does a great job on the history, but when he gets to implementing the solution, he just takes a hard left turn and goes for the Austrian economic gold-backed money solution. And, this violates my primary objective in political life, and that is deconsolidation of power.
You were going to talk about deconsolidation of power, but I'd also add, would you make the same criticism of Ron Paul?
Well, absolutely. Ron Paul goes for the gold-backed solution as well. Gold is concentrated money. It is not deconsolidating the money power. It is consolidating the money power. That's the basic problem I have with gold money. On top of that, if you look at it historically, gold has never served to democratize money. It's never served to empower or enrich the middle class. You can control the quantity of money if you have gold money, such as we did from the post-Civil War period up until Roosevelt withdrew all the privately owned gold in the 1930s. That entire period was a gold money. We were under a gold money system. But did it prevent depressions? No. You had the post-Civil War depression. You had the numerous depressions around the beginning of the 1900s artificially created by J.P. Morgan in order to justify the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Only, 20 years after the creation of the Federal Reserve System, you had, 15 years, you had the Great Depression. That we were on a gold money system at that time. That didn't help us a bit. So you can control the quantity of money, but the question is, who is controlling the quantity? In that case, the big banks were controlling the quantity of gold, and they were controlling it for their private profit. Banks have always made a profit on booms and busts. The whole science of economics is supposed to create stability. In other words, a lack of volatility in the quantity of money. The banks make a lot of money out of creating volatility, the booms and the busts. What we need is a nice, flat, stable economic system that the only way you're going to be able to do that is to have the quantity of money as close as you possibly can in the hands of we the people.
And you really also get into how the power is and wealth is so consolidated, and there's so many different levels of that. There's also the media. The media is completely owned by the financial monopoly.
Well, no, it's not completely owned. It might be completely owned, but I don't know that for a fact.
Well, I don't mean the whole media, but the big media conglomerations.
Yeah, well, the way they control them is because all of these big media outfits are mortgaged to the max, just like every American is mortgaged to the max. I have two friends who are in one of the big three-letter commercial networks in this country, and they and the top 100 executives at this firm were laid off about 2 years ago, and they were told that they were laid off because J.P. Morgan demanded that they be laid off, or J.P. Morgan would not roll over the network's loans, and the network would be out of business in a single week. So, you know, the borrower is servant to the lender. When these networks are borrowed out to the max, they cannot possibly do anything that the biggest banks don't want them to do, or the biggest banks will surely put them out of business by not renewing their loans. That's how the control works.
And basically the big corporations are dependent on the bankers as well.
Well, they're dependent on them, and many times the largest banks have hegemonic interest in those corporations' stock. In other words, it doesn't take controlling interest, 51%, to control a corporation. You only have to be the largest shareholder. Maybe 10%, even 5% sometimes will do it if it's a large block of stock. And that, on top of the fact that the banks, these corporations all have to have loans and they borrow from the banks, it's pretty complete control.
So you talk about your tax policy. You say you would get rid of the income tax and replace it with 18.8 consumption tax or national sales tax.
Yeah, the income tax is just a way for the richest individuals to not pay any tax. And also, there's kind of a repressive nature to it as well, because it's so complicated that even if you have a professional tax preparer prepare your income tax, if they're determined, if the IRS is determined to get you, they'll find some mistake in there. So we just don't need such a complicated system. If we had a consumption tax, then all of the illegal immigrants would have to pay for it. All of the people who are, it's just perfectly fair. Perhaps I think probably the fair tax is the best developed of all that. We've determined that the fair tax, I think, their founders call for a 23% consumption tax, sales tax, and Carl Denninger and I, who's my chief economic advisor, have just run some rough numbers that if we cut out, major sections of the government, we can get that down to about 18.8%.
What is your response? I know some critics of the national sales tax said that the working class would pay more than they do under an income tax, and that the wealthy would benefit the most. What's your response to that criticism?
Well, no, actually, they get a rebate in advance of the sales tax. I forget exactly what the fair tax people call it. This was something that I was kind of against right at first. Everybody who wanted it would get a government refund check. But it's really, in talking to folks just this last weekend, it seems like a relatively fair way to do it. And if you want to opt out of getting the rebate for the fair tax, then you can. So it's not a case where everyone will have Big Brother, getting a check from Big Brother all the time. And that's a perfectly fair way to deal with those who really are on the low end of the money scale. And if they don't want the check, if they don't want the government knowing where they are, then they don't get their fair tax rebate.
And you also talk about an incentive-driven society, and you bring up the issue of a social safety net. So some people might ask you if you're in favor of abolishing the safety net, but you said under your monetary reform, we would be our nation would be wealthy enough that we could still afford to provide a safety net.
Yeah, and of course this is slightly at odds with basic libertarian philosophy as well. But I think if you completely eliminated everything, I've heard the charge, you'd be returning to Dickinsonian England with people on the streets. And, the argument to that, which, makes sense. I mean, nothing is black and white in this particular area, and you won't really know how to fine-tune it until you get into it. But I think we can afford to not have homeless people wandering the streets and dying of hunger. The argument is, well, the churches will take up the slack, but, you know, churches are in the decline too. So I don't know exactly how this is all going to shake out, but I think we can afford to have some type of a safety net.
That's interesting because with the issue of the libertarian issue, there's sort of, I know the issue of sort of some libertarians have certain kind of, they try to stress ideological purity, but you mentioned you've been involved with a number of different political parties, the Democrats, the Republicans, you were involved with Ross Perot's Reform Party. What made you decide to be a libertarian?
Well, because basically I've been practicing 90% of the libertarian platform all my life in any case. Number two, the Libertarian Party is the third largest party, and they typically have ballot access in all 50 states. Initially, we looked at doing that ourselves, and it would have been very, very expensive. You have to hire professional petition signers in every state, and it would, I don't know, it would be somewhere around $500,000 if you could even get it all together on short notice. So the Libertarian Party seemed like a natural fit, and it provided a good platform, and plus it provided me the opportunities to go head-to-head with the gold bugs, the very people who are confusing the entire monetary reform issue.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this per se, but I've heard a lot of people even make the claim that some of the financial elites actually finance some of the Austrian economics, especially because the gold standard, the elites control the gold, so in some ways they would benefit from the gold standard.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And in fact, this is hard and fast evidence. The head of the whole gold bug community historically has been Ludwig von Mises, and although he's gone now, still an institute that bears his name continues to push Austrian economic theory. And von Mises was brought to this country from Austria by none the less than the Rockefeller Foundation. And in fact, the Rockefeller Foundation paid for him to be a professor at New York University for his entire career. So are we to think that the most elite of the elite foundations, the Rockefellers of Chase Manhattan Bank fame, who's now joined forces with J.P. Morgan, is actually going to propose an economic theory that would be the most damaging possible to the biggest banks? I don't think so.
It's time for a break now. Please stay with us.
We'll be back with the stark truth after this break. You're listening to VoR, ReasonRadioNetwork.com.
Well, it's the latest attempt at regulating the Internet. Now, we saw the public outcry over SOPA, but now a SOPA-like bill is being debated in Congress. SOPA was supposed to stop online piracy, but critics say the only thing it was stopping was online freedoms, giving too much power to companies, allowing them to pull the plug on sites that they think violates copyright laws. And then there was SOPA's counterpart in the Senate, known as PIPA, or the Protect IP Act. It requires more court intervention to go after an accused website. Now, there's a bill called CISPA, the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act. Now, what this bill does is allow companies to collect information about you and give it to the government. The government simply needs to request it in the name of cybersecurity. But critics say the bill is so broad, it can lead to companies and the government monitoring and censoring what people say. So is the era of Internet freedom coming to an end? Earlier, I spoke to Senior National Security Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology, Kendall Berman. I asked her, should people be alarmed? Take a listen.
There are a number of cybersecurity bills that are on the Hill right now, and we understand that probably the first of those to move are going to be in the House, likely in the third week of April, with the Senate moving closely after that. And we are very concerned about certain components of the information sharing schemes that are parts of each of these bills. And Representative